how do we define a species?
Why aren't humans and Neanderthals the same species? Why do we have fingernails?
A lot of primates are very small, especially our early ancestors, the size of mice or chipmunks. We see that they have sort of re-evolved claws. The metabolic energy consumption of a 5-year-old brain is almost twice that of an adult human. Animals that do leaping tend to have a really strongly bracketed.
Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Azarin, host of the Mike Azarin Show, formerly known as Elite Ball Knowledge Philosophy, produced, recorded, edited, named, and renamed by yours truly, Mike Azarin. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, as all guests are, Douglas Boyer. Doug, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Micah. I am an associate professor at Duke University in the Evolutionary Anthropology department, and I study early primate evolution using fossils, and I have a emphasis on the postcrania, or the bits of the skeleton below the neck. And I also run a data repository that is specialized for 3D models and what you might call medical images of museum specimens. It's called Morphosource, and it's used by museums and researchers all over the world.
What is evolutionary anthropology?
Sure. So maybe to start with the more broader definition, anthropology is essentially the study of human beings, and it's traditionally often broken down into what's called a four-field approach, which was originally sort of articulated and developed by an anthropologist from the early part of the 20th century named Franz Boas. There are the four different fields of anthropology are generally biological anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, and and cultural anthropology. Don't mean to cast any shade there. And so evolutionary anthropology, as you know, it's not in one of those categories. It's very related to biological anthropology. Or I suppose what you could say is that it is it's most often practiced by biological anthropologists, but it's an approach that can also be used um, in any of the fields. And essentially, the distinction of evolutionary anthropology is that the patterns of human variation in that we see today can be better understood by applying an evolutionary lens to all of those patterns. So one particular area of this is what you might call evolutionary medicine, which is the idea that if we understand the evolutionary context in which humans came to be, that will help us understand how the mismatch between the environment that humans evolved in and the environment that they're experiencing today leads to disease, or sort of hinders wellness, and also how evolutionary principles act to put us at risk for things like zoonotic diseases, like COVID, for example.
Very interesting stuff. So I think if we're going to talk about the evolution of humans, maybe it'd be useful to start with primates. And so what exactly is a primate?
And because primates share many features with many morphological features, and this will get to your question about, what is a primate? Because humans share many morphological features with other primates that help us recognize them as a member of that group, in order to really understand the origin of humans and how humans became the way they are. If we want to actually understand, things like the fact that we have flat nails instead of sharp claws on the tips of our fingers, that's not something we can understand by looking at patterns of variation in humans. We have to go all the way back to the very first primates to understand how the processes that differ animals with flattened nails from non-primate animals. Um, and so that gets to your question, what is a primate? A primate is an animal that is, humans are primate animals. They're mammals. They typically live in the tropics throughout their evolutionary history, and even today, almost all primates have been tropical animals, including humans. Humans are one of the few that have been able to exist in large numbers and latitudes outside of the tropics, whereas the few species, most species have done that through biological adaptations. Humans have done that through cultural and behavioral adaptations. One of the things that define humans is that we're able to modify our microenvironment. So you take away all of our cultural practices and technology that help us survive in cold weather, and humans would, for the most part, be restricted to living in tropical latitudes as well. That's in contrast to something like a dog. Dog can live perfectly well in a temperate or even Arctic environments where temperatures regularly get down below freezing without anything but its own fur. A human without clothes uh, is really not going to survive outside of a tropical environment. Um, so that's something that applies to primates in general. So there are two major divisions of primates. There are the anthropoid primates, and that's the group that humans are a member of. And then there are what you call the strepsirrhine primates. Then there's one other animal that's not really. It's more closely related to the anthropoids, but not really. But sometimes looks a little more like a strepsirrhine. That's called a tarsier. Um, Sometimes anthropologists will use a division called haplorhine and versus strepsirrhine, and haplorhines will include both the tarsiers and the anthropoids. But within anthropoids, you have the apes, you have the old world monkeys, things like baboons, um, and then and macaques, and then you have the new world monkeys, things like howler monkeys, spider monkeys, capuchins, marmosets, and tamarins, and that sort of thing. So those are all among the apes, some of the better known apes are um, chimpanzees, gorillas, gibbons, orangutans. Most people are familiar with them, and humans are just another ape. Each group of apes has their own special evolutionary specializations that make them unique and able to survive in the environment they live in. And humans are just another example of that. Um, then among the strepsirrhines, you have sort of two major groups: the lemurs and the lorises. Um, and for all intents and purposes, they're not that different. Lemurs are only found, unlike lorises, which are found in a number of different areas. Lemurs are restricted to the island of Madagascar, and there's quite a number of species there. They're all endangered. Um, Lorises are found throughout Africa and Asia in the tropical regions. Now, how would you recognize a primate? How would you know if you were looking at a primate versus a rodent or a carnivore or something like that? This is all the stuff of that we teach in biological anthropology 101. But things like uh, forward-facing eyes, sort of shortened nose, teeth that tend to be blunt and molar-like teeth. The teeth in the back of our mouth they have sort of a square, bumpy look. You open your dog's mouth, you'll see a bunch of sharp teeth. They look sort of like shark fins, or even a little bit like shark teeth. And that's especially true. That's even more so if you look at big cats, which are what we call hypercarnivores. You see these blade-like teeth in their mouth. You won't find that in any primate. You see, for the most part, fairly flat teeth, sometimes a little bit cresty or pointy, depending upon if they have more of a leafy or insectivorous or insect-based diet. Um, Now, that doesn't mean they don't have any sharp teeth. Most primates will have fairly pronounced canines, and that's more of a display item. Possibly in some cases used for defense. But that's and in many cases the canines will be the canine teeth. They'll be big and sharp. They'll be much bigger in the male of the species than the female, and that's particularly true in species where males compete with one another for access to mates, to female mates. Um, so those large canines are essentially uh, for scaring off other males of the species. So, flattened molar teeth, forward-facing eyes. In the skull, if you have a skull, and, a lot of times that, if we're looking at fossils, that's all you have to go on. In addition to the orientation of the eyes, if you can imagine a human skull, you can see the eye sockets and you can see that they're facing forward. All primates have this, a bony rim enclosing the back of the orbit. And that's it's not that there aren't any other animals that have that, but it's fairly rare among the mammalian uh, the mammalian class of vertebrates. And then, mostly we have long tails, except for the apes. Um, and in almost all cases, you find a primate and you spread out its fingers and look at it, and it's going to have, round tips and fleshy pads. A lot of times there's a pretty well developed thumb and especially a well developed big toe, and those go along with the tendency of primates to live in the trees, where they use their sort of grasping hands and feet to hold on to branches and be secure while they navigate the 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 forest. Um, so those are some of the basic things that you recognize. Now, based on these physical traits, scientists have known that primates were a natural group, or or they had correctly classified all the mammals out there that are primates as primates based on these physical features. Um, and in some cases, more detailed sort of uh, what you might call like blood flow, vascular pattern features, or neurological um, uh, features. But in the last 30 years, as we've been able to use genetic information to figure out how animals are related, um, that those ideas based on the anatomy that could be observed with the naked eye or under a microscope have essentially been confirmed by the genetic data, showing that indeed everything that sort of has these features that I've just been describing are, for the most part, genetically related as well. Um, so, um, there are a few primates that have thrown people off. There's one called the eye. It's a lemur in Madagascar. It looks a little bit like, if you've ever seen the movie Gremlins, it looks like a creature that's sort of stuck halfway, transforming between a mogwai and a gremlin. Has these big ears, these sort of beady eyes. If you open its mouth, it has, unlike any other lemur, it has two giant gnawing incisors. And those incisors, they look like what you might find in a beaver, um, or groundhog or any other kind of rodent, and they look so similar to what you find in rodents that there was a period of time during which people used to think it was a rodent. Um, Rodents have this, in addition to having this, like this, this buck tooth look. Those incisors, they keep wearing the tips down, and the incisors keep growing longer from the bottom, and that also happens in this animal called the eye. So there are a few that have sort of tripped us up, but for the most part, yeah, we can recognize primate. The other thing that sort of characterizes primates is a tendency to uh, rely to an important degree on plant and fruit matter in the diet. It's very rare that you would find a primate that is um, fully sustained by meat or even insect material. Um, so we think that's been an important part of the primate niche as they've been evolving over the eons, that they've been co-evolving with available plant foods.
Very interesting. Something I notice in evolutionary anthropology and the evolutionary sciences in general is there's a tendency to break organisms into discrete categories like species, geni, I don't know.
Genera.
Um,
Yeah.
genera. Oh wow, that's a cool word. Wow, genera. Um, and I've never heard that.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
sorry. Um, Instead of kind of continuous spectrums, like from anthropoid to, sorry, I forgot how to pronounce the other one, anthropoid to the other one.
yeah,
Um,
Strep's right.
Strapsbrine. Is that right? Strapsbrine.
Yeah.
Okay. Why is that? And especially because there's these counterexamples, like the lemur that looks like the gremlin. Sorry, I'm running on very low sleep, so my working memory's not so good.
No worries. Um, yes. So um, so this goes back to Darwin's, original work. So the um the which is called On the Origin of Species. So he goes to a lot of effort to, and many other evolutionary biologists and organismal biologists have worked on this problem of, how do we define a species? Um, and in some sense, the only the best case scenario for having like a non-arbitrary taxonomic category is um, is is the species level, and even that can be sort of a spectrum. So there you'll find a number of different um, approaches to defining species. Um, there's um, there's the sort of the most commonly used one is the biological species concept, which says that a species is recognized as a group of as the sum total group of individuals that um, do or are capable of interbreeding and producing offspring. Okay, so that's a very um, uh, I guess non-arbitrary way of like defining, the boundaries of a species, which individuals are in one or the other. Um, the Now in many cases, though, even that definition breaks down. I mean, um, there are many there are many bird species that are able to, if they come together, are able to um, mate and produce viable offspring that could also have babies themselves. Um, but the reason they don't interbreed is that they have very distinct behavioral systems, different distinct mating calls. So they might live in different areas or different parts of the forest. So they are, effectively isolated from each other and evolve their gene pools evolve um, distinct from one another. Um, and all these other groups, these higher level groups, um, as you get to like the genus level and the family level, and then the the suborder level, this kind of thing. Uh, these are either based on um, sort of what you might call sort of qualitative um, observations about like where the major gaps in variation are. What people have decided are sort of the biggest most important differences between um, in, that 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 appear if you look at all the different species. Um, the but in this day and age, we also require that those categories are consistent with genetic data or with like a phylogenetic, an evolutionary tree that shows how everything's related. Um, so that's why, for example, that requirement that the the major categories correspond with the genetics. That's the reason why we don't call the ii a rodent anymore, because even though it has a number of traits that look rodent-like in a way that really sets it apart from other lemurs, if we look at the genetics, we can see that it's very closely related to other lemurs and very, very distantly related from other rodents. Um, it hasn't shared. One way we can think about this is, and this is an evolutionary approach. One way we can think about this is when's the last time two animals shared a common ancestor. We can think about that as time, how far we go back in time. Um, and the II, based on genetic data, um, we can verify the II has shared a common ancestor with other lemurs more recently than it shared a common ancestor with any rodents. And so based on that, we feel good about it being categorized as a first of all a primate, not a rodent, and second of all as a strepsirrhine instead of any other group of primates.
Interesting. Would you be able to tell whether two um, extinct species would be able to produce viable offspring from their fossils?
That's a great question. Uh, uh, because, or I would say, an incisive, insightful question, because you know, no, you really can't. There's really no way to know that. Um, and so what we have to do, and so there are in general the methods we have to recognize different species in the fossil record probably tend to underestimate the actual number of species. Um, that on the other hand, there it can go either way. If you have a rich fossil record, ironically, if you have a rich fossil record of, we'll say, one part of the body, we'll say the teeth, because that's usually that's usually the most frequently recovered part of the skeleton is the teeth. A lot of mammalian paleontology relies on the tooth skeleton to define species, and there are various reasons for that. But if you have if you're digging up bones at a fossil site and you get lots and lots and lots of teeth from many individuals, um, you may find like several groups, like here's a carnivore, here's a primate, here's an ungulate, um, you know, or you'll be able to separate things into major groups, primates, carnivores, ungulates. Within each of those groups, you may be able to say like, okay, well, there's one species that's really tiny of the primates because the teeth are tiny little teeth and like smaller than a grain of rice. And there's a big species with the teeth that are, the size of a pea or a marble or something like that. And they're so different in size, there's just no question that that those two teeth aren't coming from the mouth of the same animal. Um, but then within the groups of teeth that are sort of the similar size, probably, it can be very hard to say if there's more than one species there, because just because animals that are separate biological species um, can have, especially if they're closely related, can have a lot of similarities in any given part of the body. There's no guarantee just because two animals are separate species that they're going to be different. If they are different, that's usually gonna um, that'll help you distinguish species. But people go to a lot of effort to try to understand how much um, how much variation to expect within a species as well. Um, and so there have been a lot of studies, looking at collections of skeletons of living biological species, or the way we describe a species that still has living individuals on Earth is an extant species, which is to distinguish from extinct species. So if you have a lot of skeletons of an extant species, you can try to look at how different the size of the teeth are, or the arm bone or the skull, with basic measurements. You can also try to take measurements that will describe differences in shape. Um, a lot of times you can do this with a ratio, like maybe you think one species has smaller eyes than another. Well, how do you come up with a measurement how do you come up with a measurement that shows its eyes are smaller? Um, and wait, you can do that by sort of taking a ratio of maybe might measure the diameter of the orbit and then like the length of the skull, and take a ratio of skull length to orbit diameter. And then you can compare that between the two and see if one is small or not. But even once you decide how to measure and represent shape and size, um, then uh, then there is this question of like, how different do two fossils have to be before you can be pretty sure that they're separate species? And so these are the kind of problems we deal with as paleontologists, and the kind of research questions that we often deal with. This is called often called alpha taxonomy. It's like you have a bunch of fossils from a site, and the first task is trying to figure out um, how many species there are, and which bones belong to which of those species.
So something I was wondering, because you said that one way you could define a species is through whether it could produce viable offspring. And I know that a lot of us have Neanderthal DNA inside of us, like
Mhm.
1% or something like that.
Yep.
And if I'm correct, that implies that like humans had kids with Neanderthals, and those kids had kids. So why
Yeah.
aren't humans and Neanderthals the same species?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a lot of different perspectives on what you might call human taxonomy when you start including the human fossil record. Um, and there, one, and this gets back to, the what I was saying before, which is that, um, at the end of the day, deciding whether two populations of organisms are separate species or not, um, is there there isn't one there isn't one test that can sort of tell you. Um, I you know if they are unable to produce viable offspring, like if you take one individual, a female from one population and a male from the other, and they attempt to mate, and they either produce a sterile offspring, that'd be an example of that would be something like a mule. When a horse and a donkey produce offspring, that's, they can produce a viable offspring, but that offspring is infertile, so it can't go on to keep reproducing. So if you take, two individuals from two populations and they're not able to produce a viable offspring, or they're not able to produce a fertile offspring that can continue breeding, then you're pretty solid on saying that they're separate species. On the other hand, if they can interbreed, that doesn't necessarily mean they're the same species, because then there are other considerations, like do they have an ecological niche, mating behavior that makes it highly unlikely that they would ever come together and breed in nature. That sort of thing with songbirds. You might have two songbird species that can produce offspring, but they never do because the courtship rituals are very distinct between the two species. The females and males only respond to the songs of that species. In
Would
a way.
sorry to interrupt,
No,
but
yeah.
would, like, let's say I remember hearing something about if you have like a very, very small dog and a really, really big dog, maybe in principle they could produce viable offspring, but obviously, like a Yorkie can't, well, reach a border collie, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like the same category, or does that constitute like something different than?
No, that's essentially similar. So, the dogs of two extremely different size breeds, genetically, if the sperm and the egg together, they could produce um, an offspring, but they just never do. That would be that that would be among the class of species defining traits known as pre-zygotic barriers. So that means before a zygote can ever be created, there are barriers. Things like the animals are too different in size, or their courtship rituals are too different. Things that prevent the sperm and the egg from ever coming together. Those are called pre-zygotic barriers. And then there's the other class, which would be, post-zygotic barriers, which be like incompatible DNA, or that don't allow the creation of a viable zygote, or things like sterility of the offspring. So that's a great question. So, but yeah, things like, behavioral differences or size differences, things that prevent the male and female of the two different species from coming together are called pre-zygotic barriers, or pre-zygotic distinctions between the species. So, so the and so whether so it is quite a but then all of this in some sense gets superseded by, well, at the end of the day, all these different tests for whether we've got two species or not are ways of assessing, are ways of getting at what is called the evolutionary species concept, which basically says two things are separate species if their populations have diverged. In other words, there was one species, but two populations have diverged. Those two populations are separate species if they stay separate and never come back together. and also have their own evolutionary tendencies. So when we look at Neanderthals compared to humans, they have, a distinctly different morphology. We can recognize Neanderthal skulls, um, and skeletons. There's, if we could measure all the Neanderthal skulls and skeletons and look at the mean and the average of Neanderthals, they would, be separate from Homo sapiens. So so in order for that sort of difference to come into being, there has to be a large amount of um, there has to be very small gene flow between the two populations. Um, and so and so that makes us think that there must have, for the most part, been strong barriers to reproduction between Neanderthal population and Homo sapiens population. Now, those could have been geographic barriers. Um, Neanderthals may have evolved in isolation from by being isolated from the rest of, what we might call, Homo sapiens, or really, really both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens evolved from a even, more primitive species or earlier species that is often referred to as Homo heidelbergensis. Um, and so, the idea is Neanderthals, came from Africa as a Heidelberg group and got into Europe, and that they were mostly, at least for a good amount of time, some period of time, were, cut off from other populations of Homo heidelbergensis and certainly Homo sapiens, and were able to respond to the selective pressures of, basically a a cold European environment, and develop their own practices and cultures and own morphological adaptations. And so they became a distinct species in that regard. Um, but but yes, what we find is that when they were able to come back to, that there were interbreeding events, and the question of whether they were truly different species or not, uh, you know, at the end of the day, it's like actually somewhat depends what question you're asking, and it depends on what the particular researcher thinks is the most important definitions. I think the fact that they, from an evolutionary species concept, how much Neanderthals ultimately interbred with Homo sapiens once they came back into contact, um, could affect whether we think they were separate species or not. So, if for the most part, like Neanderthals became sort of absorbed back into Homo sapiens, you know, the question, it would be, I think more there. It would be. I think it could be more controversial to say that they were a separate species. Um, but if there were just a couple of interbreeding events here and there, and Neanderthals, for the most part, eventually died out without kind of being assimilated back into the Homo sapiens populations that were around at the time, then it might be an easier case to say that they were a separate species. And then, I didn't even mention, but there's also the question, this thing about subspecies. Uh, biologists recognize subspecies, and and how, like, species are already, whether things are two separate species can already be a bit fuzzy. Subspecies even more. But I think that, more than defining, more than getting and because of all this, more than getting too hung up on whether two things are separate species, what we want to do is understand that the evolutionary patterns and processes relating all these different fossil groups that we have seen, and we do that with sort of an integrated approach where we, are we first, are characterizing the morphology, well, historically, it's first because historically that's the thing we've been able to measure is the morphology, which morphology is just the shape of the bones. So measuring the cranial capacity or the size of the teeth or any particular or features, the skeleton, and looking for clusters of individuals that share similarities to each other, like figuring out how many shape clusters we have, and then trying to understand, which groups are more similar to each other, which ones, and looking at their geographic and temporal relationships, and then now we have genetic. In more and more cases, we have genetic data too, and so what we're really trying to do is more than like put things into categories. Um, Redraw like the evolutionary tree, like the branching tree that sort of shows the process by which humans and other human-like populations of animals uh, evolved. And we want to understand, we want to show that pattern, and we want to understand what the evolutionary process was there. How much did interbreeding have a role? How can we understand the difference, the morphological differences between the several hominin species that we see at a given locality? Are they, did they have different ecological niches, for example? In the the Pleistocene, we have Homo habilis, which it has, we have Homo habilis and we have something called Paranthropus, at the same localities. They're both hominins, um, and one has these very large teeth, very robust facial features. That's Paranthropus. Homo habilis has, smaller teeth, more smaller facial features and such. They're two hominins closely related. How were they how were they able to live together in the same environment? Like why did they look different? Um, and answering those questions, we sort of test different hypotheses. Um, maybe they were eating different foods, and you can, the just observing the difference in tooth size tells you some of that. But you can do things like look at the micro pattern of abrasion on the teeth, um, to figure out, what the differences in diet were. Um, you can try to figure out if one is more frequently associated with stone tools than the other. So trying to reconstruct the patterns of behavioral difference. For a long time, the going hypothesis was that, there were two different kinds of hominins evolving during like a period of aridification and what you might call aridification mean like a drying of the savanna, and a period of like overall environmental degradation on the African savanna where it was getting harder and harder to get enough to eat, to find quality food to eat. So you have what we call these robust hominins or robust australopithecines that have all these very large faces, large teeth. And the idea there is that they developed these biological adaptations to just eat really tough food, and survive with basically eat whatever they came across, even though it wasn't, the kinds of things their ancestors would have liked to eat or could have eaten and survived on. Whereas then you have the alternative strategy of the of like Homo habilis, their teeth actually get smaller, and it's thought that their adaptation was to develop stone tool use and essentially use their cleverness to find ways to be able to um, continue to get high quality foods on the African savanna, even as the environment was getting worse. You know, particularly like possibly hunting, meat eating, that kind of thing.
So I guess my takeaway from all that is it doesn't really matter whether Homo habilis and Paranthropus were like different species, subspecies, whatever, so much as the morphological differences, the behavioral differences, the dietary differences, etc. Um,
Yeah.
and now, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that's an important takeaway. Yeah, I agree with that.
So now, I do want to talk a little bit about morphological, behavioral, and dietary differences. And in particular, one thing I was interested about, this whole rabbit hole I went down that I think eventually led to me emailing you, was why do we have fingernails?
The going hypothesis for a long time was that as primates became more specialized for living in the trees, and especially in the canopy of the tree, or for a lot of primates are very small, and especially our early ancestors were very small, the size of mice or chipmunks, that kind of thing. And so it doesn't have to be a canopy per se. It can just be, the understory of the forest, what you might call the shrub layer of the forest. As primates became very specialized just for being in the trees all the time, not going down to the ground, not needing to go down to the ground, um, that the claws weren't really necessary, because the best strategy for um, moving around in the trees was to develop hands that could grasp these small branches tightly. Um, and the uh, and so, from an energetic perspective, one theory says that, traits that aren't, in a trait like a sharp claw, that in some sense requires some developmental energy. If that claw is not important to survival, um, it's going to little by little be lost. Just like the fact that um, on on small islands, you find lots of species of flightless birds. Why does it happen? Because um, these islands tend to not have predators of those birds. So, like, a great example is like the dodo of Mauritius. It's a large, basically a overgrown pigeon that lost the ability to fly. Um, it lost that ability
R.I.P.
because what's that? Yeah, R.I.P. Yeah,
R.I.P.
yeah. Well, because of course, evolution couldn't anticipate that humans would find Mauritius and um, eat them by the thousands. Um, but
So
yeah,
now,
so a trait like flying, it takes uh, you know uh, constant evolutionary selection to maintain, and that selection is only there if there's a benefit to being able to fly like that. And so, these birds tend to lose that. So the claws could be a similar sort of thing. Like once primates started being able to grasp, and it could even be that, if you're focusing on, grasping as opposed to grabbing with your claws, that you might be able to grasp better if you don't have those long claws sticking out, poking into the palm of your hand when you're trying to grab things. Um, so the um So there that I think that's probably pretty much the answer. The There have been a lot of there's been a lot of sort of more detailed questioning of that idea. So, you know, about 30 or 40 years ago, a researcher made the observation that squirrels go like out to the ends of branches and get acorns and stuff. And they still have claws on the tips of their fingers and toes, and they don't have actually squirrels don't have any thumb to speak of. Um, and so the rationale was, the logic was, um, if um if claws are if if the flat-tipped nails are related to are necessary for grasping, um, and and claws have been lost in relation to that, then if squirrels are able to do the same thing as primates, they should also shouldn't have claws. Um, the and so based on based on that logic, the some different ideas were developed for why we don't have claws. Um, the research, in particular, a researcher named Matt Cartmel, who is also a professor at Duke for many years, and then also Boston College. He came up with the idea that it's not the grasping per se um, that requires the loss of claws. It's that primates were needed to be more precise when they're moving through their environment because early primates were predators and they were hunting insects, and so they needed to be able to it was an extra imperative that they get rid of any of the extra fluff per se that wasn't helping them navigate through the forest stealthily, so that they could catch those insects, and also so that they could um, grasp better. Because the idea was what you observe is that primates typically, and there's been recent research showing this, is that compared um, well, is that primates, um, when they find, especially an insect that they want to eat, they will preferentially grab it with their hand and bring it to their mouth, as opposed to like shrews or rodents and such. They'll tend to grab things with their mouth. So the other idea is that well, it's not really walking through the branches. It's like this need to grab things, um, and so it's in particular like the predatory behaviors of primates that have selected for um, the ha- the loss of the claws on the fingertips. And there was a study a little while ago that sort of measured how much sound was what was made uh, in squirrels when they had claws versus like when they clipped their claws, and they made a lot less sound. And so the they those researchers took that as evidence that you know loss of claws reduced the amount of sound that animal made moving around, and that was consistent with the idea that the loss of claws was for stealthy stalking of insects. Um, but the other thing about the other thing about it's either rationale is possible. At the end of the day, these questions about why a trait evolved can be very hard to prove or to rule out alternatives, um, because when we because in order to really understand how what a trait like the main data for kind of thinking about why a trait evolved is looking at how animals use or benefit from that trait um, today. So studies of living animals, um, and a lot of traits are um, a lot of traits are used for multiple things, and so a lot of times it can be hard to distinguish the the adaptive purpose of a trait um, by seeing in what situations it's used.
Interesting.
I will say one other thing. I think that this observation that squirrels have still have claws, um, I think involves involves a false equivalency in the sense that it essentially uses as its premise the idea that like squirrel behavior in the trees is identical to primate behavior in the trees, or that squirrel that the niche of a squirrel is identical to the niche of a primate because they both go into the trees and get food there. One thing, if you look at the and this is where the evolutionary thinking comes into play. If you look at if you look at all the different primate species, um, they basically all live in the trees. There's among the old world monkeys, there's some exceptions, but these are all recently evolved compared to most of the other you know compared to like when primates lost their claws. So you look at primate evolution and you basically got arboreal animals all the way back. You look at squirrels. Um, there are tree squirrels, but then scattered amongst that family, the Sciuridae, there are plenty of terrestrial species. So as squirrels have evolved, you've had the niche fluctuating between terrestrial living on the ground, arboreal living in the trees. And one thing about squirrels is that they live, they live in forests there is where there are the deciduous forests and pine forests of the Northwest or of North America, in temperate regions around the world as well. You have a sparsely foliated understory, and you have straight tall trunks, and then you have the canopy up above. So squirrels, they rely on those claws that you can't grasp with a thumb and forefinger, without claws, the trunk of a tree this big around. The only way you can get up it with claws. So in the evolution of squirrels, not only have there been plenty of not only are there plenty of varieties that have been living on the ground, chipmunks, um, ground squirrels, they dig little burrows underground and that sort of thing. Um, it's not a thing that primates do. Um, and so claws are necessary there. So there are lots of periods in squirrel evolution where those claws have been necessary. And this idea that that claws are present, tree squirrels can do some of the same things as primates, even though they have in the canopy or in the small branches, even though they still have claws. That is the reason why they still have claws has been described as what's called the narrow niche hypothesis. Narrow being that just what I described. So being the breadth of different niches that you find animals in. Primates have, evolved in this narrow niche where you know, most of the species have been arboreal, living in the trees, needing to grasp, not needing to, not environments where they really needed to cling. Although there are some exceptions there, which I can get back to. Whereas squirrels have evolved. Oh, you
Sorry,
okay?
I've been chain smoking for 32 years.
um, uh, Squirrels have been evolving, and rodents have been evolving in this much broader niche space. Where a given species um, might emphasize living on the ground or being in a forest where there are tall trunks and little understory. And so there's never been a long enough selection for on any lineage to lose all those claws. So it doesn't particularly require um, a a different function. It just requires like a different pattern of and duration of selection for living in the trees. I should say the other thing is we don't have a lot of controlled studies that look to see if that really have, carefully defined performance goals, and then see if squirrels or primates do better at those goals. And that's what you really need to say if claws are actually, you know, hindering just movement in an arboreal environment, or whether, they don't have any effect one way or the other. Um, but yeah, now
You
there
answered
are,
my
yeah. So there, I said there are a couple of exceptions in the primate world. So there are a couple primates that do climb on straight, tall trunks, and um, and these include the marmosets and tamarins to some degree. Um, Something called the fork-marked um, uh, lemur, uh, something called like the needle-clawed galago, and the eye. And all these animals have, and the reason why they spend time on these big tree trunks is because they will gnaw into the bark and start the sap flowing, and then they eat the sap, and so they just kind of hang out, kind of gripping onto a big trunk and eat, and they'll do all these little bore holes here and there, and then come back to them as the sap has collected, and do that. The eye doesn't do sap eating, but it uses its big teeth to gnaw into the tree trunk, and then to extract grubs that have bored into the bark and such. Um, and in these animals, in these primates that do this, um, we do see claws. We see that they have sort of re-evolved claws, and so we can see sort of a correlation between in you know in re- so we've in a sense we can do a reverse experiment to understand what claws are for. We can take a group that doesn't that to understand what the pads are for, or the loss of claws are for. We can take primates which have lost claws and see if there's any behavioral things that unite the primates that have re-evolved claws, and what we see is like the utilization of large tree trunks. um and so, I think the yeah so I think probably the idea that primates have been evolving for movement in um among, like, what you might call a fine branch niche, where you're either in the canopy or in the shrub layer, or even, for very small primates, even in a savanna with large grasses, climbing up, these, if you're a very small animal, you know a 3 foot tall, uh you know uh 3 foot tall grasses, with a stem that leads to a seed pod. I mean, that's basically a forest to you. Um, and so, and in fact, we see a rodent in Southeast Asia that has has developed a grasping has developed a big toe that's very primate-like, that it uses for grasping large grass, reeds and such. Um,
and it wraps the big toe around the leaf. Like, oh,
yes,
that's cool.
exactly. That's right.
So we only have about 10 minutes. Time flies by when you're having fun, I guess. Um,
And I know I can drone on, so
no.
you'll.
One thing I read a while ago was that primates, like I was just interested, so I Googled, when do early primate neocortexes finish myelinating? Because human neocortexes finish prefrontal cortex is finished myelinating like 25. So I was wondering, like, maybe do more um like less intelligent primates and humans, their prefrontal cortex may start myelinating earlier, and like maybe part of the reason that humans are smarter may have to do with this sort of play, to or like wandering, learning about the world, to exploiting that knowledge trade-off. And when I Googled it, it said that like early primates, like 2 million years ago, um, their prefrontal cortex is finished developing at 6 or 7. Not to be a child. Um, but like, how do they know? How can you go from the, I guess, bone structure to that? Sorry, it could be that like in most species, the age that the prefrontal cortex is finished myelinating is the same as the age that sexual development stops. That
Mm.
I remember reading that, but then that I guess then the question is, how could you tell when sexual development stops?
There's a histological approach to it. So if you have the teeth, of an animal, um, every day, while that animal is while the adult teeth are developing, um, new layers of enamel or dentine are being laid down. Those are the two materials that compose our teeth: enamel, dentine, and cementum in the pulp cavity. Um, and w- uh, what researchers have gotten really good at doing is like identifying particular kinds of stress, and in many cases, um, if it's a female individual, they can they can pinpoint um, the by looking at variation in those lines, the um, first pregnancy. Um, and so that could be, that could be one way. Not knowing more about the study, it'd be hard for me to say, exactly what's going on in that argument. One thing I will say, so um, uh, is not directly related, but it's somewhat related. Um, an area that I have studied is where we did a small research program on this. I'm not actively doing it anymore. I have a former student who's continuing it, but we looked at how to estimate the blood flow to the brain from a fossil, um, and what and the reason we were interested in that is because by understanding the rate of blood flow to the brain, we could estimate the metabolic um, energy usage of the brain. And one thing, and the energy demands of the brain is a system that has been thought of as centrally important to human evolution, because the idea is that the brain gets bigger, it's metabolically more costly, which means it requires more calories or higher quality food, which then essentially puts what you might call a cognitive pressure on the species to be able to find those foods. So it's sort of a positive feedback cycle. Like a bigger brain helps you more successfully find high quality food. Um, but the bigger brain costs more, so you need more high quality food. So there's like this feedback cycle, and that could even ramp up into things like sociality, whereas where um, social living, um, and where individuals um, help get food and share food is a way of ensuring more high quality food is available. But social living also adds additional cognitive demands, which could require a bigger brain, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of times, people talk about like a large brain as being, an important trade-off. That is, you want a bigger brain, but it but why don't all animals just develop really big brains? And because the trade-off is that those big brains are metabolically expensive. And what we usually what people often say is like that, the well, people know that, I mean, so people made the argument that like the metabolic cost of the exceptionally large human brain drove a lot of other aspects of human evolution, kind of like I was just talking about, like sociality and um, food sharing and that kind of thing. But that's the premise there, is sort of that, like, this uniquely expensive brain requires unique evolutionary solutions. But what if lots of other species had brains that were similarly expensive? Would we think differently about the brain cost and the brain evolution as being the thing that drove other aspects of human evolution? And so what we tried to do is see if we could estimate the relative cost of the brain in a bunch of different species, including, um, fossil species. And actually, what I will say is there are very few species where we've actually been able to measure the cost, the metabolic cost of the brain, like how many calories the brain is consuming, or even the blood flow rate to the brain, because you need the animal to be sitting still while the brain is imaged. And you can tell a human to sit still, but you can't really do that with other animals. And there are some invasive methods of doing it, but like those methods are for the most part aren't acceptable, aren't ethically acceptable for applying for applying to primates.
You can't like anesthetize a monkey. Like an ethics
Yeah.
board would not be
Well,
happy.
you could, but that doesn't produce, but that changes the brain energy
Mm.
usage. Yeah. So
Yeah.
for the most part, they're like invasive to the degree that the animal's being, and you don't want an animal that's like freaking out either. But
Because then
anyway,
it'll be even more expensive.
yeah. The fact is there's only a dozen or so species that have been measured for brain metabolic costs.
So
Um,
how do they get those to like chill out?
with invasive methods. I can't, um, which typically involve like sacrificing the animal at the end of the experiment and assaying aspects of the brain. And these have been done over the years. So, essentially what we did is you, um, but a way of estimating the brain's metabolic cost is looking at the blood flow to the brain, because the blood is delivering the energy to the brain. And how can we look at blood flow to the brain? Well, if we can measure the size of the arterial canals bringing the blood to the brain, then we can use some hemodynamic equations to estimate the flow rate. And so what we did is we um, measured aspects of we measured like and you can estimate the size of these arteries because there's a hole in the skull for that artery to go through. And so we did a series of studies where we essentially measured the size of those holes for the arteries in the skulls, and using that plus information on the brain's overall size, um, estimated the metabolic cost of the animal's brain, and then we compared those estimates to the actual measures in the few species that had been measured for it, and we found a really strong. We found that that those morphological measurements were very successful at predicting the metabolic cost of the brain. And so then we were able to estimate brain metabolic costs in a whole series of species, and and then um, and then we took those brain metabolic costs and looked at them as a ratio of the overall um, basal metabolic rate of each animal. So how much is the brain costing relative to the cost of the whole body, operating the whole body? And we found something pretty interesting. We found that while primates did have a much higher relative brain cost than chimpanzees, um, which we might think of as telling us a little bit about the group that humans evolved from. there are plenty of other species which had relative brain costs that were similar to humans, including um, some of the some very including various lemurs, including even what we call including the group that's the most closely related to primates. What they're called tree shrews. Some of those had relative brain costs as high as humans. Um, but what turned out to be quite interesting is that, and so this made us think about, the cost of the human brain a little bit differently. It's not that humans don't have an exceptionally expensive brain relative to their other metabolic costs. There are certainly other animals that have that. But where we saw a big drop off in brain costs is we look at a bunch of rodents too. All the rodents had much lower brain costs than all the primates, and also this group of animals called tree shrews. And so, so one thing we concluded from that is, the big change in brain metabolism was really was not even the origin of primates, but an origin of a group called the Euarchonta. But Euarchonta, like tree shrews, share with primates a number of characteristics, like living in the trees and big eyes and using an omnivorous dietary style, and also small litter sizes. So primates typically have there are a few exceptions out there, but primates tend to have just a couple babies, 1, 2, 3 babies at a time. That's the same for tree shrews. They will have twins. Rodents, on the other hand, have lots of babies. They will have, litters of 5, 6, 10 or more babies at a time. So this difference in brain cost seems to corresponds in at least to a difference in reproductive strategy from, having lots of offspring that are mostly fending for themselves. Probably most don't survive. That's why they have a lot of them, versus the primate and tree shrew approach where you just have a couple of offspring and you care for them. And then, it's not for nothing that, humans do have a much higher relative brain cost than chimps, suggesting that, even if there are other animals out there that have high brain costs, when humans started evolving, they probably evolved from an ancestor that had relatively low brain costs. And so as the human lineage evolved higher brain costs, it probably did add other selective pressures for, things like group living and better technology for more reliably procuring food and that sort of thing. But, also going to your question about the, brain development, it's quite interesting. As the brain develops, the brain is 90% of its adult size by 2 years old. And it's full size, in a 4 or 5-year-old. Now, interestingly, but in a 5-year-old, the brain is the same size as it's a full adult size, but it uses almost twice as much energy. The metabolic energy consumption of a 5-year-old brain is almost twice that of an adult human. And that's because because the brain is developing. It's doing what we call, it's growing and pruning synapses at a very high rate. And uh, and so, we think this is and so this peak in energy consumption, if you plot the brain's energy consumption in human over the course of the baby to adult, you see it goes up and then it peaks and then it comes back down again. And that peak happens like between 5 and 7. And so, yeah, I mean, and clearly there's still development happening, like you're talking about the myelination and that sort of thing, but that's not associated with this energy use peak. So, whereas an adult human has like 25% of their energy budget going to their brain, a 5-year-old, 5 to 7-year-old, as much as 60% of the calories that they're burning are going to support their energy requirements of the brain. So when I find that's a good statistic to recite uh, to first graders when they don't want to eat their food, or they want to eat candy instead of something healthy. It's like your diet is extremely important. Your brain is growing. More than half of your energy is going to support your brain. Now, do you want to be feeding it candy and junk, or do you want to be feeding it something that's healthy and going to grow and support your brain? But
Maybe
um,
I gotta start eating less candy and junk then.
yeah, you might think about it. But at the and so what was actually really fascinating is that we were able to in anthropology collections around the world, we were able to measure the size of the holes for the arteries in everything from infant skulls to adult, with that everything between. And we were able to show that that peak in energy consumption that we see from direct measurements is also predicted by the arteries, or by the holes for the arteries. So we can see that. So you could imagine, in practice, it'd be very difficult to get a comparative sample like this. But let's say you could get a comparative sample of Australopithecines, or some fossil human that was, you had babies, infants, or babies, you know juveniles, adults. You could potentially measure the holes for the arteries and look for that peak in energy consumption. That would tell you if they're having similar brain development, because we don't see that peak in energy consumption um, in the species in other animals, as far as I understand.
Interesting. So I have about 20 minutes until I have my anthropology class. So I'd like to
Yeah.
rapid fire some questions at
Okay.
you. Okay, number one, when you were talking about the hemodynamics and the blood flow, and I remember reading somewhere that the blood of our ancestors was kind of different in its composition. I don't know how different early primate blood was from our blood, but when I was thinking about how you would determine the flow of the blood, like through the arteries, maybe it depends on some properties of the blood, like its viscosity, and obviously like the literal,
100%.
um,
Yeah,
like cross-sectional area of the, I forget
that's
what
right.
this is. Yeah. So what if, like, do we know if the actual like blood is different of our ancestors, and does it kind of take that into account?
Um, so I'm not aware of data suggesting differences in blood viscosity. The but And so in it's been a few years, but as I recall, in the methods that we used essentially some standards from human data for measurements of blood viscosity. Um, uh, there's there's a number of researchers who do what you might call evolutionary physiology, or evolutionary or comparative physiology, comparative biomechanics. And so quite a lot of um, those measurements are available. Tables of measurements of viscosity and its variation, that sort of thing, in that literature. Um, but certainly, if there was differences over time in blood viscosity, um, that could create essentially an offset. Um, but that shouldn't uh, change whether we see that um, that peak. Now, um, it could change what if I mean, the other issue is we can't, we can't really, we don't have good ways of estimating the basal metabolic rate um of fossil primates either. So it'd be hard to say how that ratio of brain metabolic use to body metabolic use changed.
How could, I guess, like a tiny, tiny ankle bone tell us from an earlier primate, tell us that that primate was, I forget which specific primate was, but that primate was like a powerful leaper or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, yes, um, there are a number of traits that have been argued to correlate with uh, the uh, the degree of leaping, or the frequency of leaping, or the ability of leaping in primates, of the ankle itself. So, um, and the ankle is an important link in the leg, in the hind limb. Um, uh, so, uh, in animals, animals that leap, they're putting a lot of power through their leg, and they need that leg to essentially just extend in a single plane. They don't want to roll their ankle as they're uh, you know, uh, people who are going for a run on a trail, and they uh, step on a rock. The ankle can roll easily. That's because, our ankles are fairly open. There's not a really strongly bracketed hinge joint in our ankle. Animals that do leaping tend to have a really strongly bracketed hinge joint. And so you can essentially, from that one ankle bone, you can look at how open the ankle joint is and how much mobility and movement is allowed at the ankle joint versus whether that mobility is restricted just to a hinge-like motion. And the animals that leap tend to have more of a hinge-like motion. Um, there are some other traits as well. You're putting a lot of power, you're putting a lot of force through your ankle bone when you're leaping. So the particular ankle bone we looked at is called the astragalus. An astragalus with a sort of a rotational surface that's thicker, will withstand more force better. And so, what has been described as a deeper body or a thicker body is also associated with, of the astragalus, is also associated with more leaping. And so I can look at traits like that and make some inferences about the likely degree of leaping.
Okay. Could somebody download a fossil from Morphosource and 3D print it? And would it look like the same fossil? And if not, what features are lost when you take a fossil and create a 3D scan?
Sure. Yes, you can do that. You can download a model of a fossil and 3D print it. It really depends on the scan. There's some of the if because the scan is it's the model is made by scanning the fossil, scanning it by essentially with a sensor of some sort, laser, X-ray, um, uh, optical, and it really just depends on how um, how high how highly resolved, or how high the signal to noise ratio is of that sensor that's scanning it. It's going to determine like how fine scale of features you can see. In a really high resolution one, you'll be able to see the edges of like where the bone was articulating with another bone. You'll be able to see little holes in the bone where like blood vessels were going in and out. One that is lower resolution, you may not be able to see those boundaries between where it touched other bones and where it wasn't touching a bone. Some of those small holes, or they're called foramina, where blood vessels were going through, might not be captured. Um, but yeah, that's the sort of thing. For you even with fairly low resolution scans, you'll get a really good sense of what the bone looked like. Um, if you were to kind of turn it over in your hands in terms of the overall shape of it.
Okay. And it seems that a lot of the evolutionary sciences have a kind of teleological perspective on, I guess, like evolutionary processes. Like the way that they talk about it is this evolved for that, or like, and I mean, obviously that's not literally, you know, what I am, at least from my knowledge, what happens, and versus other sciences that take a more mechanistic view. Does taking that teleological goal-oriented view of evolution ever cause any problems in practice?
Well, so
At least in
um,
our understanding or
the
like,
I think the I think it I think the in principle um uh the or let's put it this way, the if you read, carefully written descriptions of the understanding of the evolutionary process, it's not teleological. The it's, what the evolutionary process um is there is no goal per se. The way evolution through natural selection works is you have variation in a population, um, that pop in morphology, we'll say, or in, physiology. That population lives in an environment. Um, some variants are going to be better able to survive in that environment than others. Those variants that are better able to survive will be more likely to mate and reproduce and pass their genes to the next generation. And those variants that aren't able to um, will be weeded out of the gene pool, as it were. And so the change. So we see the phenotype tracking the environment, and we call that adaptation. We call that we say that phenotype um, is is specializing for some aspect of the environment or being selected for. Um, but it doesn't require any foreknowledge of the evolutionary process. Um, that said, um, the it I think it can be easy for when people are thinking about evolutionary explanations to slip into teleological thinking, and it's important. Um, and so scientists who are good scientists are careful, not to do that. Um, uh, but but yeah, I think I think that research that is not being careful to remember that evolution doesn't have a goal um, tends to um, not be very high quality. Put it that way.
and then this is the last question. Oh, also I need to show you that I have a math tattoo because I show all of my guests.
Sweet,
Um,
nice.
that's just like a shtick that I have to do, but I wanted to do it when I was talking about the hemodynamics,
Yeah,
but I forgot to.
I couldn't
Um,
see it very closely. What is? I don't know if I'll recognize the equation or not. So is it an integral um, of like force times distance?
it's the fundamental theorem of calculus. It just says that
Nice.
like the derivative of an integral is the original function.
Nice. Okay.
Um,
I gotta review
FTC
my
part one.
yeah. I gotta review my calculus. It's been a while. Okay.
In fact, what you were saying about the different tests for um like species kind of reminded me of like calculus, and that's when another time I wanted to bring it up because I was thinking about there's a lot of ways to tell if a series, like there's a lot of sufficient conditions for whether like an infinite sum converges, but there's not a lot of necessary ones. And
Right.
similarly with the species, there's a lot of sufficient
Yeah.
conditions, but not a lot of necessary ones.
That's a good way of putting
Anyways,
it. I
yeah,
like you. I like that connection. Yeah. Yeah.
thank you. Okay. My last question that I have to ask everyone at the end of every episode is, do you have any advice for me?
Do I have any advice for you? Um, just in life or
Yeah. Like
yeah.
life. anything, whatever floats your boat.
Hmm. I think, you know, keep asking questions and getting, interested in in other fields. I think, I think one of the great, I think, I think, I think what moves us forward, towards new solutions and more than anything is, and getting fresh ideas is, it's just talking to people who are sort of doing different things or interested in different things, from you and uh, finding where you can sort of synergize.
Thank you.
Like just you bringing up, the notion of, sort of commonalities between, biological issues and mathematical, issues is, is a cool reminder for me of that.